Any discussion of the French Revolution that goes on long enough turns into a discussion of Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon did not have a prominent role in the early phases of the revolution and really only came into the story in 1793 when he returned from Corsica and threw himself into French politics. He was given a post with the army of Italy and quickly found himself commanding the artillery at the siege of Toulon, a vital port city in the south of France that had gone over to the British, taking with it most of the French Mediterranean fleet. Napoleon performed so well there that he was given a field promotion to brigadier general. He then balked at an assignment to lead troops in the west of France against rebels there, and his career as a military man almost ended. Protected by his political patrons, though, he found a position working in the map-making bureau of the army in Paris in the summer of 1795. By the fall of 1795, he had rehabilitated his reputation as a general and had put himself in the good graces of the new government, called by historians the Directory, after the five-man executive council that led it. He did this by helping protect the National Convention against a royalist uprising in Paris on the 5th of October, 1795, the 13th of Vendemiaire on the revolutionary calendar, and thus known to us as the Vendemiaire crisis. We'll talk a bit here about what caused this crisis and how it resolved, as well as how Napoleon behaved during it and how it helped his career. The National Convention had managed to see off the threats of the far left in late 1794, and by July of 1795 it had seen off the immediate threat of a royalist invasion. The deputies set about writing a new constitution, the primary purpose of the convention since its election in 1792. The body had written two constitutions already. The first, mostly written by the Marquis of Condorcet, had been set aside after the Girondins were purged, and the second, adopted by France through a nationwide referendum in the summer of 1793, had been suspended by the convention and never came into effect. In the summer of 1795, that constitution was set aside as far too radical and as tainted by its association with Maximilien Robespierre and the radicals of the Jacobin left. The committee created to write a new constitution set itself the goals of preserving the republic from threats of a return to monarchy or a return to the radical republic of the period of 1793 to 1794. The deputies who wrote a constitution that summer claimed that they were returning to the principles of 1789, and by this they meant that the republic would be governed by the best educated, most capable, and most reliably Republican of its citizens. Universal manhood suffrage was kept from the Constitution of 1793, but these first-round voters would choose electors rather than deputies. A stiff property requirement at the second round meant that the electors would be all solid men of property, and the electors would choose the actual deputies to the legislature, keeping any radicals out, at least in theory. The new legislative body would have two chambers, and the executive would be a five-man directory chosen by the legislators. Elections would happen yearly, with one-third of the deputies standing down to be replaced, and each year one of the directors would leave office, determined by lot, to be replaced again by the legislature. The key goal of the new system was stability. There was to be clear separation of powers and a delicate balance of powers as well. In addition, it would take at least 9 years to amend the Constitution. The deputies of the convention hoped to render opposition to the conservative republic they founded ineffective, whether from the left or from the right. The Constitution of 1791 had been imposed rather than ratified. That of 1793 had been ratified, but never put into place. The Constitution of 1795 would be ratified in a nationwide referendum to ensure maximum political legitimacy, and then adopted. It was this decision to hold a referendum on ratification that caused trouble. The deputies were determined not to make the same mistake they had made in 1791, when the National Constituent Assembly had decided that the deputies who had written the Constitution would be ineligible to sit in the new system, a self-denying ordinance, put forward by Maximilien Robespierre, by the way. Instead, the convention decreed that 2/3 of the deputies to the new legislature would have to be elected from the men currently sitting in the convention. This, called the Two-Thirds Ordinance, was wildly controversial and terribly unpopular. The ordinance guaranteed that the new body would be dominated by the same men who had ruled since September of 1792. Any hope for a good showing by Jacobin sympathizers or by royalists was precluded by this ordinance. The Constitution and the Two-Thirds Ordinance went out for approval in early September, and when the results were announced on the first day of the new revolutionary year, that's the 23rd of September, 1795 for us, the Constitution had been approved by an overwhelming margin, but the Two-Thirds Ordinance had barely been adopted. Far more men voted on the issue of the Constitution than had voted on the Two-Thirds Ordinance. In Paris, only one of the 48 sections of the city had voted in favor of the Two-Thirds Ordinance. As soon as the results were announced and the Two-Thirds Ordinance was declared to have been adopted, dissatisfied murmurs rose up from around the city. Sections in the west of Paris, a wealthier and more conservative part of the city, refused to disband their electoral assemblies, and it began looking like a new insurrection might be at hand. This uprising would be different from previous ones. It was predominantly an affair of the least revolutionary parts of Paris, and some of the rebels were openly royalist. They were relatively well equipped and organized, and their natural opponents, the leaders of the sans-culotte movement and the Jacobins who might have opposed a royalist insurrection, were mostly in prison. The convention found itself threatened from the right and hesitated about what to do. On the 3rd of October, there was a royalist uprising in a small city about 40 miles away from Paris. This was the signal for 7 sections in western Paris to declare themselves an insurrection and mobilize their National Guard units. The convention sent in what army units they had on hand to force these sections to lay down their arms. But rather than confronting the rebels, the general in charge sympathized with them. He accepted a promise that the rebels would stand down, and he withdrew his troops. The rebels did not stand down and did not disarm. The convention found itself facing an insurrection and wasn't sure how to keep its own troops loyal. The convention gave authority to defend it to Paul Barras, an ex-noble who had deftly moved from ardent supporter of the Jacobins in 1793 and 1794 to a conservative critic of the Jacobins by Thermidor. Barras was known to be corrupt and without principles, but he was also known to be a man of action who could get things done. He gathered a handful of generals he could trust as good Republicans and sent them to set up defenses around the convention hall, the certain target of any attack. One of the generals he recruited was Napoleon Bonaparte, rescued from the doldrums of the map-making bureau and told to acquire artillery and position it to defend the approaches to the Louvre and the Tuileries where the convention met. Napoleon took to the task with relish, sending a previously unknown cavalry captain from Gascony named Joachim Murat out to seize cannon and drag them back to the center of Paris. Napoleon himself oversaw the placement of the cannon and was certainly present when they were fired into the crowds of civilians and National Guardsmen approaching the Tuileries Palace from the north and from the bridges across the Seine to the south. These insurgents had some 25,000 men on their side, but they were short on muskets and powder. Moreover, though well led, they had no cannon. The convention had only 6,000 soldiers, supplemented by a variety of sans-culottes and old Jacobins who'd been let out of prison to help in the defense. The fighting took all day. Finally, in the late afternoon, the forces of the convention fired cannon on the insurgents as they marched forward on the defenses. It took over 6 hours of fighting in the end, but the convention was saved. Later that night and into the next day, army units loyal to the convention marched into the rebellious sections and after fierce street fighting, subdued them. Paris was definitively disarmed in the aftermath of the Vendemiaire uprising. The event became a central part of the story of Napoleon's rise to power. In his memoirs, Napoleon noted that he had led the defense of the convention and that all it took was a, quote, whiff of grape shot, unquote, to beat the Parisian rabble. This claim is a good example of Napoleon's great ability to rewrite events to put himself in the best light. Barras later claimed in his memoir that Napoleon had been merely one of the officers Barras had directed in the defense of the Tuileries, and dispatches and letters from the time support Barras's account. The convention gave the lion's share of the credit to Barras, and Napoleon at the time agreed that Barras had led. Still, Napoleon had done well, and he supported Barras when it counted. His reward was a return to the good graces of the army and his promotion to general in charge of the Army of the Interior. Napoleon had been vaulted from the obscurity of the map-making bureau to a major command. Soon after, Barras would arrange for Napoleon to lead the Army of Italy. It was in this Italian campaign of 1796 to 97 that Napoleon showed his real talent for command in the field, for reorganizing civilian affairs to support and benefit the military, and above all, his talent for self-promotion. He was not the only general in 1795 who had great ambitions, but his support for the convention at a critical moment had given him the opportunities he needed to shine. Even though he had not been in charge, it was with the convention's victory of the 13th of Vendemiaire that his star began its rapid rise.